So I'm happy to be here today, and thanks to Dean Faulkner for organizing this class. And so today's topic looks at immigration. And so I'm a historian of U.S. foreign relations at Syracuse, and I teach a number of classes on that subject. And while most people think about immigration as related only to domestic policy, it's actually where we see an intersection between foreign policy and domestic policy, as I'll talk about today. So there are many ways that we can tell this story. And one of them is with this simple image, which is, as many of you will recognize, a Chinese takeout container. And in a number of ways, this is a symbol of the immigration experience, right down to the fact that it says enjoy and thank you in English. But it's also emblematic of the immigration in another way, which is that Chinese food was originally this ethnic food that was located in very select cities on the coast, initially San Francisco. And what we see is that it was really this ethnic food that was first presented and sold to Chinese immigrants, made by Chinese immigrants for Chinese immigrants. It was a way for them in these communities, particularly in San Francisco and then later in New York, Los Angeles, and Washington, for Chinese immigrants to eat food that they recognized, and especially the ingredients that they recognized, certain smells and tastes, but it was also affordable. And for most of the 19th century, so we're talking as Chinese migrants first come to the United States in large numbers because of the gold rush in California. So that's one of the reasons why they settled in the San Francisco Bay Area and San Francisco itself. That for most of the 19th century, that is the predominant customer base for Chinese food will be Chinese migrants. It'll also be, besides basic labor, the main source of income for many Chinese migrants, followed by laundromats, or Chinese laundries, rather. But what we'll start to see is by the turn of the 19th into the 20th century, something interesting starts to happen. And that is when Chinese food will be discovered by white middle-class Americans, particularly tourists, and food connoisseurs. And what's interesting and kind of paradoxical about this story is it comes at the same time that there is this broader crackdown on Chinese immigration and the exclusion of Chinese migrants to the United States. And so that discovery of Chinese food is actually going to lead to another aspect of the immigrant story, in a way, an assimilation. What we'll start to see by the 20th century is Chinese American cuisine. Right? And this will be a particular type of cuisine that is distinct from Chinese food and Chinese cuisine you would get in China. So this image is chop suey, which is a distinct Chinese American dish. And so by the turn of the century, what we start to turn into the 20th century, the first few decades, we're going to start to see the rise of Chinese American cuisine. And that will be consumed by not only Chinese immigrants, those who are still here and now settled, but now we're white middle-class Americans. And chop suey, which is based on dishes based in China, these stir-fry dishes in China, will actually be adapted to the American palate. So it's going to be more liquid, it's going to be sweeter, and some of that has to do with the available ingredients, but also Chinese restaurants adapting to this new customer base. And so where we get to by the 1980s, and why the 1980s important? Well, because we now have diplomatic ties and diplomatic recognition between the People's Republic of China and the United States. So after 4 decades of non-recognition and hostilities, that will be broken. And by the 1980s, what we'll see is that Chinese food is the largest consumed ethnic food in the United States, some 30% or more. To where we are today, where you can see the image of one of the original Chinese markets and restaurants in San Francisco, to at the Shine Center, a corporatized, homogenized version of Chinese American food in Panda Express. So this would appear to be a successful immigration story. But of course, there's more to it than that, right? Because one of the things we've kind of run over in that story is the fact that you had a migrant community that was effectively ghettoized in San Francisco, in coastal cities, in which they were isolated and then discriminated against, the racism and xenophobia that they experienced. And then over decades, roughly almost a century or more, that the food, if not necessarily the people, will become uh, adapted into the United States as now Chinese Americans, just like there's Chinese American cuisine. So the story I'm going to talk about today when we think about immigration also builds on this, that there are a number of push and pull factors when we think about immigration and the role, for example, of and largely of American capitalism that is pulling immigrants to the United States, and the need for cheap, plentiful labor that drives immigration in the United States, and pliable labor at that, but also the push factors, the discrimination at home, the lack of experience, and sometimes ethnic strife, wars that push people to migrate. And what we'll see is over time, as we see in a way in the Chinese American experiences, as those migrant communities become settled in the United States, they're going to begin looking for new rights. How do I become a citizen? And what kind of rights come with being a citizen? And then the contested process around citizenship, who is and who is not a citizen, what rights are available to that person, is a contested process that continues until today. So this is a brief overview of the lecture that we'll be getting to. And so let's start with those push and pull factors. So some of them will be familiar to you. And on the push side, what I want to emphasize is the following, that when we look at whether it is East Asia, South Asia, Western Asia, East and Central and Southern Europe, or Latin America, the broader Western Hemisphere, we can identify a number of similarities, one of which is reforms and modernization. It's important to remember in these areas, particularly in East, Western, South Asia, and into Central and Southern Europe, you had broad, multi-ethnic, multinational empires. And many of them are under pressure, both internally, sometimes from nationalization movements that are attempting to splinter, but also from the Western European empires, Britain and France especially. And this is going to require some of them, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, for example, will undergo internal reforms and modernizations in an attempt to keep up, to maintain their imperial holdings. And that is going to have a pressure on the population, because often those reforms and modernization come around a couple of things. One is the conscription, modernizing the military into a conscription-based military. Increased taxes, and that will put a lot of pressure on, for example, the peasantry and the agricultural farmers. When you think about these territories, they are large agricultural bases. Some of that modernization is going to include attempts at industrialization to keep up with Western Europe and the United States. And within that will also be internal repression and conflicts. Some of this will be religious-based, some will be ethnic-based, and one of the things we will see is that will also serve to push people to leave. The imperial interventions. This will also be, as Britain and France especially, but also Germany, attempt to expand their holdings and put pressure on, for example, the Russian Empire, Austria-Hungary, again, the Ottomans. And as they expand into broader South Asia, the colonization, for example, British colonization of the South Asian Peninsula, but also into China. And with that, we'll see, again, the push for immigration. The economic dislocation, I already mentioned, some of it driven by some of these reforms and modernization, but other factors. And we don't often talk about it much, but this is a time of great technological change around the Industrial Revolution. So you can think about the massive factories that are being built, but there's also components of the steam engine that include improvements in travel. So now it's much quicker with the steamship, as you can see on the slide, for those steamships to get from the Mediterranean to the United States. So we've dramatically cut down the time of travel, the role of the telegraph, and almost instantaneous communication, not like we think of today, but much quicker than anyone was used to. And then the role of the media, the rise of what's known as print capitalism. So the large number of newspapers and magazines, the greater amount of literacy. And within that will be, of course, advertisements that I'll come back to, advertising the amazing economic opportunity, some of it real and some of it fake, in the United States. And finally, on the push are the early pioneers. So these will be the individuals who left first, sometimes by themselves, sometimes one or two, that will get settled in the United States, and then attempts at family reunification, and bringing others to support if they have a small business, or to tell them there are great opportunities here for people to come. And so the pull factor is often the one that's most discussed, for example, when students take a class like this as a high school student or even an early undergraduate. But the role of economic opportunity, the amazing economic opportunities that are in the United States with this massive growth. But again, what's needed here is cheap, pliable, and plentiful labor. The role of labor recruiters, oftentimes some who are scrupulous and sometimes who are unscrupulous. And I'll talk a little bit about in a second. So you'll see these advertisements kind of advertising all these great jobs that are available in the United States at a high wage when individuals come. That may not be the case. And so we don't have a lot of information on those individuals, for example, who return, the reverse migration. And so some estimates are, depending on the population, they had nothing to return to, right? In part because they left because of discrimination. That roughly 10% will go back. Sometimes it's as high as 25% is the estimate of reverse migration. Family unification will play a major role. So once one individual from a family comes, bringing their brother, their sister, their spouse will be a key factor. Immigrant aid societies will also help with the pull factor, especially with family reunification. And then one of the things I discuss in my classes is the role of American missionaries who have gone abroad, particularly in three areas. What we now think of as the Middle East, China, and India will be the three major areas of focus for American missionaries. And they will also encourage individuals to come to the United States in order to get an education, to work, but also return. Not many do, but that's one of the goals. So another way we could tell this story is by the gateways. But there are a number of silences when we do this, because focusing on Ellis Island or Angel Island ignores, for example, African Americans, how they were brought to the United States through bondage. And then, of course, the long process of African Americans becoming citizens, becoming recognized and getting full rights. And so that's an immigration story that in and of itself we need to do a whole lecture on. I'll touch on some aspects of it where you'll see, but that's not when we think of the gateways, how many African Americans came to the United States. They came through a much more traumatic process. And so Ellis Island, which is open longer and which many would think of as kind of the welcoming area. So there's a way we think about this juxtaposition between Ellis and Angel. One which is there to welcome and one which is there to exclude. And so Ellis Island processes something like 75% of all immigrants who come over a 5 to 6 decade period. Angel Island is open for a shorter period and only 1 million are processed. And its goal is really to enforce exclusion, in this case, the exclusion of broadly East and South Asians. And so again, that story only tells us, by focusing on those two, only tells us part of the immigration experience. But so once they come, and this is where we can look at, for example, another aspect of the story to focus just on New York City. And so when you think about over this, as the slide tells you, over roughly 3 decades, the massive transformation that happens, particularly in urban areas, but in New York City especially, and then we'll see it again on cities on the East Coast, as well as some of the West Coast, but Boston, Philadelphia, Washington. And so from 1890 to 1924, over 20 million migrants will enter the U.S. And then one of these stories is how many of them are children. In some cases, that children who are not accompanied, so unaccompanied children who come to the United States. So New York is not just a city of immigrants, but it's really a city of youth. It's a very young city during this period. Over 2.75 million children come during this 3-decade period. And so from the 1900 census, we can see that New York City is estimated to be roughly 3.4 million residents, and about a third of them are foreign born. And that number, sometimes it's higher than that, sometimes it's a little lower, roughly between the 19th to the mid-20th century. By 1920, the 1920s are going to be an interesting part of this story, and I'll come back to it in a bit. Over 40% of immigrants were originally from Southern and Eastern Europe. And so here on the slide, you can see a picture of the Lower East Side. And predominantly by 1920, what we're seeing is immigrants who are Catholics and Jews. And so we're seeing an amazing transformation of not just New York City, but the United States itself. So in New York City, and some of this will be replicated in other major urban areas, including Chicago. So one of the silences in this lecture is we're focusing a lot on the coast, but not on the Midwest. But thriving Jewish and economic life, cultural and economic life, Yiddish is spoken by roughly 20% of New Yorkers, over 40% of children in New York public schools. I mentioned it's a young city, are from Yiddish-speaking families. You're going to have a Yiddish press. We'll see this is going to be replicated in some of the other ethnic communities we'll see, and that pictures of the public market in the Lower East Side. The banks, Jewish banks, theaters, and a Yiddish press. And so this is one description of the Lower East Side from a former resident who talked about these pushcart markets. And this, he says, where I was introduced to seeing a chicken having its neck slit. And I remember being horrified, he says, as the blood came out. And you see all these things, live fish being taken out of this container and hopping around. And these were the sights and sounds that I still remember them in the background of my mind. He talks about how, later in the interview, how his mother never really had to leave the neighborhood. She spoke Yiddish only, and she only interacted with Yiddish store owners and other members of the community and in that neighborhood. But that neighborhood often abutted another large neighborhood and another large ethnic community. And so we think of what is Little Italy and that dramatic transformation. So one way to think about this story is, of course, the role of Catholicism and how it has changed in the United States. So by 1850, before that broad swath comes in from Southern and Eastern Europe, Catholicism was already the largest single denomination in the U.S., but these were largely German and Irish Catholics. And many of the churches and schools were built around that. That is, of course, now going to dramatically change from 1890 to 1920 as you start to see Poles, Italians, Greeks, Russians come into the United States. And so what we'll start to see are churches, schools, and social and health services along those ethnic lines. We will also start to see by the turn of the century into the 20th century the rise of a national Catholic Church. So one in which it's no longer along ethnic lines, but one that appeals nationally. So one of the major areas that they will settle will be in New York City's 5 Points. So up top is a picture of the 5 Points during the Civil War era, where it's dominated by Irish immigrants. And then from 1880 to roughly 1920, and this is where we get to the bottom picture, over 4 million Italians will arrive, and they're going to settle in this area, what was the 5 Points, in and around something known as Mulberry Bend, that's now Columbus Park. So Mulberry Street and Columbus, present-day Columbus Park, will be the core of Little Italy. And what you'll see is roughly over 10,000 Italian Americans will be in 2 square miles. But it's not the only Little Italy in the 5 boroughs. You'll have another Little Italy in New York. You have large communities in Brooklyn and Staten Island. So these are some of the stories that I think a number of Americans are familiar with. In fact, they're from one of these ethnic or religious groups. And one that they're less familiar with, and this is a class that I teach on America and the Middle East, but it's going to play a role here. It has some similarities, but it'll play an interesting role about who becomes an American and why. And so while many Americans can probably identify Italy on a map, or including at this time, Italy on a map, or if you think about Russia, it became more difficult to say who or what is a Syrian. So in the 1900 census, we will see individuals who come into the United States where these are the territories or countries where they claim they were from: Syria, Turkey, Egypt, Palestine, Morocco, Assyria, Persia. And then the origin points tell you how broad this is because of the cities. So Damascus, Beirut, Alexandria. And what you have is a map of what's known as the Greater Syria province of the Ottoman Empire, which includes, as we think about it today, present-day Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Israel, Palestine, some pieces of Turkey. And those will broadly be identified as Syrians. Why? Because it depended when you came into Ellis Island, where the vast majority, if not all, came in. If the immigration officer made a determination based on your origin point, if it was a city or place they recognized from the Bible. So they may or may not have known about the Greater Syria province in the Ottoman Empire, but they recognized Syria from the Bible, and thus you became a Syrian. If you were from Damascus, if you were from Jerusalem or Cairo or Aleppo, or even as far away as Algiers or Tripoli, these were the Bible lands. And so what we'll start to see is major communities of these quote unquote Syrians in New York City, Boston, Atlanta, but also out to the Midwest. Again, as I mentioned, we're not going to spend a lot of time in the Midwest in this lecture, but Toledo, Ohio, and then Detroit, where many will work in the now emerging by the turn of the century auto industry, initially recruited by Henry Ford for the Ford plant. And much like we see with Little Italy, or for example, the Lower East Side, it's going to settle around Washington Street in New York City. And so by the 1920 census, we'll have about 8,000 quote unquote Syrians. The majority are Christians, but there's a sizable Muslim minority, and about a third are women, including a large percentage of women who come from present-day Lebanon, who worked in the silk industry in Lebanon and then bring those skills to the United States. And as you can see, much like we see on the Lower East Side, it's a thriving community, over 400 Syrian-owned stores with a variety of different businesses, everything from the restaurant like you see in the bottom picture to groceries, dry goods, import-export, and then street peddlers. And the street peddlers are going to play an interesting role here for us because they are going to travel. So many will come into the United States through Ellis Island. About a third will stay in New York City in the Syrian colony, and then many will stretch out to those other communities we just talked about. And that's going to trigger part of our story here. But much like we see in the Lower East Side, there's also a vibrant literary scene. So 40 Arabic language newspapers that have a readership that is nationwide, not just local. And some of them are dual language, Arabic and English, one of the more prominent ones, in fact. And then, of course, Khalil Gibran, who's one of the more famous Arab American writers who will write The Prophet, comes into Boston, but then settles in New York City where he writes and publishes The Prophet, a well-known work that's still read today. Now, part of this Syrian story, why it's important to this lecture, is the following. U.S. naturalization law is going to be very specific. Who can be naturalized? Aliens being free white persons and aliens of African nativity and to persons of African descent, in other words, former slaves. And so what we'll see is, especially among street peddlers, for those who go into the South, that they're going to experience discrimination because of Jim Crow laws. And so we're going to see the overt discrimination in the South and the more kind of economic discrimination that they'll experience in the North, but some of it also based on complexion. So between 1909 to 1923, a third of all naturalization cases heard in the United States will be brought by quote unquote Syrians, who are now contesting not just discrimination they're facing often in the South, but nationwide. And what they have to do is now present evidence that they are white. And what they will argue are the following, based on economic success, property ownership, and that they're Christian. So Costa Najjar, who is pictured up top, is originally from present-day Lebanon. He has an olive-skinned complexion, and he's going to bring his naturalization case in 1909. And so now the judge is going to have to make a determination. Is it complexion or place of origin? And in the Najjar case, what we'll see is he will decide that because he was from Lebanon originally, he is a quote-unquote Syrian, that he is white because it was a place in the Bible. But much of this is going to be based on each judge and a determination that the judge makes. So, for example, the following year, there'll be what's known as the Ellis case. And there the judge will rule based on language, religion, and moral character. The Halajian case, which is roughly the same time, in which Armenians will be determined to be white, much like quote-unquote Syrians. And I'll come back to that case in a second, because you can see the standards that are being applied. But much of this is going to be based on the individual judgment, if not all of it, on individual judgment of judges. And in a moment, we'll talk more about kind of the role of scientific racism that also forms this. But this will also be challenged by the Shaheed case in 1913, where the judge rules not on geographic origin. We'll say that doesn't count, that non-Europeans are not white. And again, we'll look at the Halajian case in a second as to why. This will be challenged by the Dow case, 1914-1915, in which the judge will say parts of Asia are white based on geography. And the argument there is going to be, the judge will effectively argue, that Western civilization traveled westward from Asia Minor, everything he had learned, as he will argue, as a child in his kind of version of Western civilization classes, but as well as the Bible, the movement of civilization from Asia Minor through Greece to Rome to Britain to the United States. So therefore, these individuals are white, but not all Asians. So the Osamah case in 1922, that Japanese are not white and Indians are not white, will be determined the following year. So you can see how this is really not based on anything scientific in any way. It's really up to individual judgment of the judge. And the assistant U.S. attorney on the Halajian case kind of explains why. That without being able to define a white person, he says, the average man in the street, and so this is kind of the average man in the street rule, understands that it's difficult to determine whether or not a Turk or a Syrian is white or quote-unquote yellow, Asian, with as much ease as he would bestow that designation on a Chinaman or a Korean. Right? So we're going to see much of these broad determinations of race, and that will play a role as well in immigration law and how immigration is implemented. Now, of course, not everybody got in. There were a broad category of undesirables. And one way this occurred, much like we talked about how judges would make certain determinations on whiteness, this was a health risk. So depending on who the immigration officer was, would be now broadly applying a health risk to individuals. And sometimes it was based on ethnicity. In some cases, they were very real. So issues of tuberculosis, trachoma, cholera. But in other cases, depending on the immigration officer and their attitude or their perception of individuals, it could be applied to Russian Jews, Syrians, Italians, just depended who was working that day or that month. Another way that that individuals were excluded was intelligence tests. So the focus would be, quote unquote, on the mentally infirm. But much of this was related to labor. Could these individuals work? Could they take care of themselves? So again, labor is this key factor in immigration. Eventually, what we'll see by 1917 to 1920 will be political alignments, in particular of targeting. And this will also have an ethnic role, as we'll talk about in a bit, aligning based on anarchists, socialists, communists. And of course, all of this predates the Chinese Exclusion Act or runs in line with it. And so one way to think about the Chinese Exclusion Act is that it's not just one law, but it builds on several laws and then amplifies them. And then the broad application of Chinese to much of East Asia, so also being applied not specifically until it's challenged, but also to Japanese and Koreans until separate agreements can be developed with with those governments, as we'll see in 1907 and 1908. And part of it is when that tries to be applied to Japanese and Korean migrants, right, they'll be challenged. I'm not Chinese, I'm Japanese, it doesn't apply to me. So the United States will then go and cut separate agreements. But that Exclusion Act will also be applied to Chinese migrants who are actually in the United States, try and go back home for whatever reason, and trying to return, and they won't be allowed back in. But immigration is going to have a nativist backlash, as you can see in the cartoon on the slide. This idea of undesirables, that Europe is dumping its undesirables on the United States, will be an important factor. The fact that, as we talked about, cities are dramatically changing. And this idea that it's cities that are changing, but that's not really bleeding into rural America, but rural America in part because of politics and, of course, the rise of newspapers emphasizing this urban-rural divide and this changing America will add into the nativist backlash. Some of this will be driven by religion, in particular an anti-Catholic backlash. As I talked about, if by 1850 Catholicism was the largest denomination, that has dramatically changed by 1920. It is even greater by 1920. And of course, the role of scientific racism. Applying a scientific rationale or pseudoscience rationale to explaining these differences between ethnicities or religions and mainstream quote-unquote white society. And what we will see is that especially in the post-World War I period up to World War II, the role of scientific racism becoming really favored by elites. And of course, you would find these, and then tied to the politics of the time, and eventually informing the European fascist movements. But by 1917 to 1924, we're going to have two major immigration acts that are going to have a dramatic impact on immigration. The 1917 Act is where we'll start to see the rise of what's known as the Asiatic Bar Zone. This will build on the Chinese Exclusion Act. And here's going to be targeting at South Asia and Southeast Asia. And then, of course, literacy tests is another way that immigration will now start to block, immigration law will now start to block individuals from coming in. This will reach the apogee really in 1924, the 1924 Immigration Act, where we'll start to see restrictive quotas based on the 1890 census. So it'll be some percentage of 2% of the immigrants who came in from a specific territory. And this is where you start to get the challenge to who is and who is not a Syrian. So as you'll see in this slide, you can see the impact of two legislative acts that we're going to talk about. So one is, here's the 1924 impact. You can see the sharp drop in the number of immigrants and immigrants as a percentage of the U.S. population. So it has the intended effect, those quotas. And then in 1965, which we'll come back to, the sharp increase in the number of immigrants, and then not as sharp, but still an increase in the percentage of immigrants of the U.S. population. So the 1924 Act, we'll come back to it in a bit, is also going to help inform some of the policies we're seeing today, at least the perceptions of it and the perception that it worked and why. So deportations. Up until the 1920s, there were really no immigration limits, and there was no time limit on the enforcement of immigration law. And so one of the issues here is that there was really, when we think about the only way that people were excluded was the undesirable portion, being labeled undesirable, until we get to the Chinese Exclusion Act. And that's where we'll see the first deportation provision included. But because it's focused on the Chinese, this is going to, of course, it won't apply to, for example, Italians, others who come in. So it will be challenged very quickly in 1893. And this case is one of several Supreme Court cases we'll look at that has a dramatic impact on and persistent to today. So two determinations will come out of the Supreme Court with the Ting case. First is what's known as the plenary power doctrine. This idea, it takes us back to what I said at the beginning, that the federal government's authority on immigration is an aspect of foreign policy. So they get to dictate on immigration law. This is not a state-based issue. It is something that the federal government, that basically the executive branch can dictate in working with the legislative branch. Okay, so that power resides with the federal government. The other key determination, this will be important, is that deportations are civil procedures, not criminal, meaning that it's going to restrict rights. So, for example, you don't have a right to due process, right, in a civil procedure. So several key aspects will be limiting here in how individuals can challenge immigration law and being excluded, and that will persist to today. Now, as I talked about in the previous slide, the public charge rationale is going to be linked to this idea of who can be let in because can they take care of themselves? Are they mentally infirm? Are they able to work? So again, that role of labor. So if an individual is identified as being at risk of being a public charge or would be at a public charge, they could be deported. By 1917, and that's going to be important for several reasons. So the real trigger here is two or threefold. It's important to remember in 1917 that World War I was not very popular at home. It had to be sold effectively. And it's also a time of great labor strife, also linked to the war because of shortages, because of rationing. And so we have a large number of strikes around 1917 with labor organizing. And so this idea that these are being instigated by foreign-born and foreign assets. So the ideological component of deportation we'll start to see it becoming criminalized. Again, the focus on anarchists, Bolsheviks, and communists. And again, here's where 1917 becomes important because of the Bolshevik Revolution. Another aspect of criminalizing deportation, this takes us back to the role of ethnic communities, the role of moral turpitude. So these would be individuals who were particularly involved in the human trafficking or sex trafficking business. This was a way for the federal government now to deport them, was the idea that they had a moral turpitude, that they were, in a sense, engaged in activities that were undermining the United States. So see, these are some of the key aspects, but that ideological component, as you'll see up to 1965, is going to carry us through from World War I into the Cold War, and will become even more pronounced as we talk about kind of the securitizing, not just of immigration, but of deportation. Now, of course, taking us back to the early examples I mentioned, being an American citizen could also be a contested process. What were your rights and how could they be challenged? And so much like Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans faced much of the same racism and xenophobia in the United States as they came in through immigration, the limitation of that immigration through a gentleman's agreement with Japan, and then what happens to those communities as they become settled over time. This is going to come to a head with World War II. And in the wake of Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt will sign Executive Order 9066 in February of 42. And this will be, again, we're going to see the role of labor in this executive order, because it's going to be applied to the Western United States, but not to Hawaii. One of the reasons why is that Americans of Japanese ancestry, as they'll be termed, comprise over 40% of the population of Hawaii at the time, and it was believed that it would have an impact on labor and on the American war effort. So they were not interned. Instead, it's going to focus on established and very wealthy Japanese American communities in the West Coast, particularly California. So over 120,000 Americans of Japanese ancestry will be interned, and you can see here on the slide, attempting to challenge this. I'm an American, as this sign says, for a Japanese American who would be interned and had to sell his business and businesses, homes at often at extremely cut rate prices, pennies on the dollar. 2/3 of those who were interned were American citizens. The others were legal permanent residents. And they were put into 10 camps that are hastily built. And I'm going to show a picture in a moment, but you can see the picture of the children. Everything's going to be packed into small bags, and you are sent to these hastily made camps, sometimes former racetracks, sometimes abandoned army bases, sometimes not even that. And what we'll see is by 1943, the War Department is going to implement a loyalty test. And what's interesting about this loyalty test is it comes at a time when the War Department also determines that Americans of Japanese ancestry there was not a risk. So the justification of the executive order will be to prevent future acts of sabotage related to Pearl Harbor. But the War Department determined very quickly that that was no longer a risk, and the Americans who were being interned were in fact not a risk. They will be held until 1946, in some cases even later for those who were deemed to be an instigator within the camps or challenged, for example, these loyalty tests. So the loyalty test will be given. You have a number of Japanese Americans who will refuse to take it, and they will be isolated. They'll be marked as dangerous. And I'll talk about an isolation center in a moment, which is here in Tule Lake. So Tule Lake is a large camp on the border between California and Oregon. And you can see here some of the makeshift, how quickly these cabins are, and the conditions are poor. We have reports of not only physical assault, but sexual assault. Conditions are poor. You have a lack of food. But there's going to be an attempt to maintain a home, to create some kind of community. Here, the newsletter, the Tule Lake newsletter. Now, a few years ago, we hosted this young woman who was born in the camp. Doctor later became a clinical psychologist and professor who treats and works with the children of the internment camps, Dr. Ina. So she was born and raised in the camp. This is her mother and her brother. Her father was an individual who was deemed disloyal because he refused to do the loyalty test, and he would be in prison until roughly 1947. And one of the things when she does the counseling with children in the camps is to talk about that trauma, as you can see here in this slide, of the children who were ripped from everything they were known, everything they knew, put into these camps where they watched their parents being humiliated, often by the guards, as well as some of the other actions that went on within the camp, and that trauma that stayed with them and was a lifelong trauma that they endured. But as we saw with the Tin case, this is another Supreme Court case in which this action will be challenged. And Fred Korematsu is going to challenge the internment order. He will be convicted, and he's going to challenge his conviction. And that case will be heard by the Supreme Court in 1944. And this is one of those cases that has implications because the Supreme Court will find that, in fact, the government had the right to intern him under those previous plenary powers and the national security doctrine. But eventually, and we'll talk about this in a moment, that case will be put in a different light. And President Truman, as you can see here, by June of 46, is going to issue an executive order ending the internment, but that's 9 months after the war's ended. Almost a year after the war's ended, for how long that internment went on. And what we'll see is, and this is part of the Cold War, is that Japanese Americans will, as Japan becomes an ally, move from being determined to become an enemy alien to a model minority. And part of Japanese Americans not just being a staunch Cold War ally, but a continued American ally, this is the foreign policy, an overt foreign policy aspect, will be a revisiting of the Korematsu case and the internment. And it's revisited in two ways by the 1990s. The United States will apologize and issue reparations to Japanese Americans who were interned. And Fred Korematsu will get the Presidential Medal of Freedom. But at the same time, a number of individuals will look at the internment as an example to be copied. And we will hear this again today. We've heard it after 9/11, and we've heard it even more recently, that it was successful in preventing acts of sabotage. But there were no acts of sabotage planned. And in fact, what we've seen is American citizens who were jailed and their rights stripped in mass. But that's ignored in that story with some of these unscrupulous commentators, but it's still looked at as a possible example to be copied. And the negative aspects and the reparations have been ignored. And the role of Mexican labor and American capitalism is going to mirror much of what we've talked about. And the only major difference is the following: that from prior to 1848, those territories in the West were part of Mexico. And so this was not an issue of transit across that new border that was what became a new border after 1848. But the need for cheap, pliable labor will continue even after that border is put in place. In fact, it will persist well into the 20th century, into the first 2 decades of the 20th century. And this is, of course, in several key areas. Agriculture, construction will be another one. And this is, we're talking from 1848 up to 1929, 1930. So Mexican labor will not have this issue of coming back and forth across this new border, what had been Mexico and was now the United States and the Southwest and Western states, particularly to work in mining, agriculture, and construction. But the Great Depression is going to have an impact, and we're going to see some interesting aspects here. One, because now we're seeing that mass movement of labor from the Midwest, particularly due to the Dust Bowl, but also from the East to the West, where there is believed to be jobs, again, in agriculture, mining, including, as we'll get to it later, construction. And because we now have a large labor force of white labor, we're going to start to see a crackdown on Mexican labor and a push for reverse migration. So we'll see some of what we're seeing again today. Very public deportation efforts in public parks, making examples of individuals to force Mexican labor back. But it's done in such a way that it's not just Mexican laborers who are deported, but American citizens. So at least 2 million, and the numbers are rough. At least 2 million were deported. 1.2 million of them were American citizens. And this will be a case, much like we see with the internment, where the state of California will eventually apologize. It's the state of California, not the federal government, unlike the internment, that will apologize in 2005, almost 70 years later, for deporting American citizens. But World War II, just like with the Japanese internment, is going to have another impact on labor. And so, of course, because of the need for men to go fight, and we'll see women going into the workforce, but now the need for Mexican labor and the creation of an authorized worker program known as the Bracero guest worker program. So Bracero literally means, we focused on men, literally meaning men who work with their hands or work with their arms. And so as you can see here, during the war period, roughly from 1942 to 47, over 200,000 authorized workers will come into 24 states. But this is going to continue in the post-war, into the Cold War, where we'll start to see by 1964, a total of over 4.6 million guest worker visas will be issued. But the unauthorized labor force is always going to be much higher. In some cases, the estimates is difficult to get this, but the estimates are roughly that 3 times as many unauthorized laborers will come in. And there'll be the Bracero guest workers also going to have this impact in a way on popular culture. So the great folk troubadour Woody Guthrie, who writes This Land Is Your Land, will hear on the radio about a tragic airplane accident, still to this day, one of the worst airplane accidents in California history, in January 45. And so you can see the plaque on the slide that recognizes the 28 Mexican citizens who died in an airplane accident near Coalinga, California. So these were part of the Bracero guest worker program. They were being flown home because their visa had ended, and the plane crashed. But the radio reports only identified the 4 Americans in the crew, not the 28 Mexicans who were only identified as deportees. And Woody Guthrie wrote the song Deportee, playing right at Los Gatos, which has been covered by at least a dozen famous artists, everyone from Bob Dylan and Joan Baez to Johnny Cash and Bruce Springsteen and Dolly Parton down the line. And in many ways, it's a timeless song, which is why it's continued to be copied. It also tells us something about the timelessness of the need for laborers in these areas, particularly agriculture. And so I think this verse is particularly important. My father's own father, he waded that river. They took all the money he made in his life. It's 600 miles to the Mexican border, and they chased them like rustlers, like outlaws, like thieves. And what he comes back to in the refrain is on the radio broadcast, even though they knew the names of the Mexican laborers because they had visas. They were only identified as deportee, and this will be the line, and all they will call you will be deportee. And there have been efforts now to actually change the plaque because they know who the 28 workers were. And so some historians have gone back to kind of challenge this and to name those who passed, and so that they're no longer these faceless victims. But even though the Bracero program goes into 64, the Cold War and securitizing deportation is going to kick in by the 50s. And here will be the idea that we need to know who's coming across the border. They could be national security risks. They could be communists. And so from 54 to 55, we will see something known as, which is basically using a slur to launch this operation to deport over 1 million Mexican migrants. And it's one of the largest campaigns at the time up until today, but it has links back to what occurred during the Great Depression, and then, of course, what we're seeing today. But that securitizing deportation versus the economic component we saw during the deportation will, of course, be amplified. So if during the Great Depression there was an economic rationale, here it's a security rationale. And that security rationale is what will persist from the Cold War to the post-Cold War and what we're seeing today. Now, by 1965, as I mentioned, this is the second major legislation we're going to see. President Johnson is going to pass this act. He's going to do it very publicly at the Statue of Liberty. And it's going to do several things. The first is it's going to take us back to the 24 law we talked about earlier. It will abolish the national origin quota system. And it's going to establish a preference system for occupations. Again, that role of labor, which is so important. And the secondary justification, which would be family reunification. Now, what President Johnson didn't want to overtly admit, but what the goal was to have a larger number of Western Europeans coming into the United States. That was what they believed would be the goal. Because they're looking for doctors, they're looking for engineers. And instead, it's going to have an unintended consequence of increasing immigration from other areas, but not from Western Europe. So as you'll see on this slide, and I'll come back to it, what we'll actually start to see from the 65 law is a drop from Europe, but an dramatic increase in the Western Hemisphere, and then a larger rise of Asian immigration. So again, dramatically changing the face of America. So from the 60s to the 80s, what are we going to see? Mexico, the Philippines, South Korea, India, Pakistan. And from the 80s on, China will be a major source, including Chinese students who become the leading source, source country of students on American campuses, particularly not just from the 80s up until very recently. Cold War refugee resettlement. So also identifying and the role of foreign policy here will be important. Certain refugee classes that will be identified as because they were allies or they assisted the United States, in this case Cuba, after the Cuban Revolution, and Vietnam during the Vietnam War and after, will be two major sources of immigrants, and because they were seen as worthy refugees to come to the United States. But the 65 Act is going to have a backlash, much like we saw with that nativist backlash in the 20s. It will take a longer time to evince itself, but it has influenced some of the anti-immigration acts and rationale that we've seen over the past decade. So as you can see here, even from 2001 to 2013, very similar. Western Hemisphere as 45% of total immigrants to the U.S., but Asia, in some cases, higher than the Western Hemisphere. And then Europe and Africa, even Africa increasing above Europe as a major source. So from the 1980s to the 1990s, we're going to start to see an attempt to revisit immigration law, and it's going to go in a couple of different directions. In 1986, we're going to see a law passed by President Reagan, which for the first time is supposed to target businesses that, and again, finally looking at the demand aspect, not just the supply aspect, but the demand aspect, that's pulling in laborers who hire undocumented immigrants. But in order to kind of balance this, to get support for this among Democrats, particularly in Congress, was a broader provision of naturalization. So we'll see almost 2 to 3 million immigrants who came in to the United States prior to 1982 who will be eligible for naturalization. Sometimes it'll be referred to, although President Reagan did not want to use this term, as a broader amnesty. But there were definitely aspects of it that could be copied again. And there were always, because of that negative backlash and the idea of amnesty, it's not the term that was used. But it won't stop there, because by the 1990s, we're again going to see a push for, and it's going to be twofold, the need for immigrants of certain education backgrounds and in certain occupations. So incentivizing as well as family reunification again in the 1990s. But this will also coincide with, from the 1990s really to today, the demonizing of immigrants, the applying of the term illegal immigrant. Some of this will take us back into a little bit into the 80s, but from the 80s into the 90s and beyond, that term is used almost invariably to demonize a certain set of immigrants, while others are seen as doing it, quote unquote, the right way or seen as preferable, often related to foreign policy issues. And then where we are for the past decade has been this attempts to really roll back to 1924, and this is where we are today, in fact. Visa suspensions for 75 countries has been in place during the second Trump administration, and a challenge to birthright citizenship, an unprecedented challenge that's in front of the Supreme Court today. But building on our earlier, if we think about kind of taking us back to the Great Depression, the economic justification for reverse migration to a security, the national security justification that we see during the Cold War, to now a full-on militarized and security justification. So we're seeing a militarized role of enforcement, copying some of those earlier elements, the very public arrests of individuals, the creation of arrest quotas in which ICE officers or Border Patrol officers are incentivized to arrest just based on numbers, and then not based on whether or not an individual has a valid visa status or even if they're an American citizen. These are more than anecdotal cases of individuals saying, I showed my real clear ID, my passport even, and the immigration officer said they didn't care. This is the ICE officer. I was arrested, and they said they would sort it out at the detention facility. And one of the reasons why is because of arrest quotas, that they benefit each time someone is arrested, not whether they are detained or even deported. just based on a simple arrest. The use of family separation as a weapon to disincentivize immigration, so in which children are being separated from their parents, or in the cases, some of the cases we're seeing, in which children are being used to bait the parents to come out to be arrested. Much like we saw with the internment, the rise of makeshift detention facilities, including, and you see the patch for these new makeshift facilities down in Florida would have been deemed alligator Alcatraz. This is literally the patch, actually the patch that is on the ICE officer's uniform with the Grim Reaper and a boned alligator, which raises the question as to if the top picture of militarized enforcement of ICE officers with masks and full military gear on a helicopter is not intimidating enough. The use of that kind of imagery on the patch sends a certain message. And one has to question why that message is needed, particularly since these are individuals who have not necessarily broken or have not committed major offenses. Connected to this is the role of third country deportation. This, in fact, also takes us back to the internment. So one aspect of the internment that's often not discussed, the Japanese-American internment, was that roughly 2,000 Americans, if not more, were deported to Peru as part of an agreement between the U.S. government and Peru. These individuals had no connection to Peru at all, but were deported there, never able to return. So literally stripped from the United States and dumped in a foreign country. And we're seeing that again with third country deportations, in many cases to countries that have poor human rights records, into facilities overseas, as we're seeing in El Salvador, that are notorious for being places which have for bad human rights records and bad treatment of their inmates. And then the fact that this ties into arrest codes, where we're seeing individuals who are here legally with valid visa status, and even American citizens who are being deported and having to fight to get back or to fight that deportation order. In some cases, not even an order, they're just put on a plane. Which brings us to the end of the lecture and the fact that this is where we sit today, in which the top picture, which immigration officers and Border Patrol officers have been sent into major American cities to intimidate, to frighten, and broad-based arrests, in some cases with individuals who are still with valid visas. But those same push-pull factors that existed for the last 2 centuries still exist today, and that still drive mass immigration today. And the need for cheap, pliable labor, that's the lifeblood of American capitalism, is still the major factor. It's not a major factor, it is the major factor. So addressing the immigration issue also means addressing issues of foreign policy, what creates instability in these areas, the trade policy that encourages or undermines local economies and forces people to leave, as well as domestic economic policy and labor laws. And so the immigration issue, I would argue, requires policymakers and the public to have an honest discussion about these issues and the true cost of products, especially food and agriculture, that have been largely obscured to the American public because it's based on cheap, unauthorized labor. And so, and for jobs that the vast majority of American citizens and lawful permanent residents will not do. So this will also require policies and a discussion that are based on the realities of both the U.S. and the global economy, rather than demagoguery and xenophobia. Thank you.